Hello guys, welcome back to another episode of this series where we are talking about integration testing and unit testing inside of React applications. So this is episode number 9. In this episode, we are going to add an API layer to our application. And then we're going to create mocks for the functions that we have in that API layer, and then we're going to test that. So if you take a look at the application, let me show you. So inside of the app.tsx, right now we are maintaining our, employee array here with 2 employees, right? But chances are you have a backend API that you are communicating with to get your employees or to update them, delete them, and so on. So in that case, of course, we need to be able to interface with that, backend API through some functions. So we are going to create an API file, right, with different functions for adding, deleting, updating, and, different operations on an employee. And then we are going to update this app.tsx file because we do not want this array here anymore, because we are fetching our employees from our backend API, and then we are going to mock those functions inside of the API file, and then we are going to test them. So in this episode, let me tell you this. I actually do not have a backend API. So inside of that backend API inside of that API file that I told you, again, we are going to store an array. But the beauty of this solution is that whether you have a backend API or not, you can, start mocking the API functions and then test them. So if, for example, you have a backend API, you can use the fetch or Axios or whatever to communicate with that backend API, fetch your data, fetch your employees, and then, test the, logic of that API file. But to keep things simple, we are not actually going to communicate with a backend API. We are going to maintain an array of employees, but we are going to simulate the operations in a way that the API file gives the impression that it is actually communicating with a backend server. Let me take you to the code and show you what I mean. So this is the employee API file, right? If you take a look, we are creating this array. We are simulating a delay, right, of some milliseconds to kind of simulate that backend API, and our communication with that backend API is going to take some time. And then we are creating different functions. For example, get employees, which is going to return that array, right? Which is going to return that array after, for example, 500 milliseconds. Add employee is going to add an employee to that array, as you can see here, after a delay of 500 milliseconds. And then update an employee is going to update an existing employee based on the ID after a delay. Again, delete employee, right? But you do not, of course, have to maintain your array of employees here. This could be inside of a backend API of some sort. But I told you, to keep things simple, I have decided to create this here, this list of employees here. So yeah, we are going to create this folder API and the file employee API.ts. So here I'm going to create my API and my employee API.ts, and I am going to write the code for that API. If you want to learn more about interfacing with a backend API from React, I've got courses and playlists on my channel that you can watch. So there is going to be this hard-coded list of employees, array of employees, and then we are going to have 4 operations: adding, updating, deleting, and getting the employees. And again, if you want to learn about promises, I have another playlist on my channel that you can watch. Adding an employee, getting an employee, now updating an employee. But guys, as I told you before, I assume you are already familiar with these concepts because this playlist is focused on writing tests. But if you want to learn more about these concepts, there are playlists on my channel that you can watch. So this is my simple API file, right? Now, let me wrap up the delete employee function. This is the API file. Now, inside of my app.tsx, I need to make some updates. Right now, I want to use this API file to load employees, to add, update, or delete employees, right? Right now, if you take a look at app.tsx, we are maintaining this hard-coded list here. And then we are, creating some functions for adding, deleting, editing, and so on. But what I want to do now is to get rid of this and create a new version of this app.tsx which uses that API file. Again, we're going to need effect, use state. We're going to need the employee. We're going to need the employee form, the employee list, and of course, we're going to need the API. We're going to import everything from our API file. Then we are going to write our app. So again, two states, employees, loading and error. We have another state for editing an employee, tracking the employee that is being edited. And inside of use effect, we're using actually the API to get employees. We're using promises, then catch finally, and then we are going to write the handle add. For handle add, again, we are going to use the update employee from our API. Or we're going to use add employee based on the fact of whether we are adding a new employee or updating a new employee. The next one is handle delete, which is again going to take advantage of the API delete employee function. We're going to set employees via state after deleting, and we are going to check the loading and error state as well. Then we are going to render the employee form and the employee list component. Something else that I want to talk about is how I am handling errors and loading. So this is again something that I have talked about inside of one of the other playlists that I have here on my channel, communicating with a backend API from your React application using, for example, thunks or using handstack query. You can check them out. But because these options, these functions, add, delete, update, can actually fail, I am maintaining these two states, right? Loading and error. And if something fails, if you check this out, if something fails, I am going to set, for example, these two states, loading and error. When I am, for example, getting an employee, when I am in the middle of getting an employee, I am going to set the loading state to true, which is, true by default. And when I'm done with get employee, I'm going to set this to false. And if something fails in the middle of getting an employee, I am going to set the error state. This is a pattern that, it is repeated inside of the other functions as well. For example, for handle add, if there is an error, I am going to, set the error state here. This is, as I told you, something that I have covered inside of my other, playlists. Or for example, for handle delete, this is again something that I am doing. So I am tracking the state of the operations, right? Now, let's continue. Now we want to write integration tests with mocking the API. Now, you could argue if we mock the API functions, it is not going to be an integration test. It is going to be a unit test. But because we are combining our app.tsx component and our, employee form, employee list component, because the test is integrating more than one component, it could be considered an integration test. But again, I totally understand if you mock your API functions, that is sometimes a unit test. You could, for example, use another test code, another test file for testing the API function, the API functions inside of that API file, employee API.ts, all together, and then unit test the let's say app employee list and employee form components by mocking, isolating the API functions. You could omit writing tests for the API functions and solely focus on writing tests for your three components. Writing tests for the API functions, add employee, delete, update, and get employees is not that difficult. We have already done something similar inside of this utility function. If you remember from previous episodes, we wrote this and then we tested this here. So right now you can take the same approach and for these functions, create a test file and test the behavior of these, different API functions. But our focus right now is on writing tests for our app.tsx. So that is going to be an integration test because it is integrating more than one component. This is our app.tsx file right now. I am going to remove this. And of course, you can, get this from the previous branch, episode number 8. And I am going to write a new version of this code file. This new version is going to communicate, is going to, use the code that we wrote for app.tsx, this code that is using the API file that we created here. So let's write this. Again, we are going to import our dependencies. We want to mock the API functions. Keep that in mind. So we want to mock the API/employee API, the get employees, add employee, delete employee, and update employee. These are mocked. Now we're going to import the mocked API. And then we are going to write the first describe block. App integration with mocked API. We're going to, before each test, we're going to clear all mocks. The first test loads and displays employees. So using the API, using the get employees, we are going to test whether we get this Alice, who is a developer at the IT department. We are also controlling the loading state, and we expect Alice, developer, to be in the component. The next one is adding a new employee. So we're controlling the behavior of this mocked version of the add employee function. We are going to say that if we add an employee, we expect to see that employee inside of the component. The next thing that I want to test yes, we expect to see Bob, who is a designer at the design department, to be inside of the component. The next one is updating an existing employee. So get employees. We are going to control the behavior. Is going to return one employee whose name is Alice, developer, IT. Then we're going to update the employee. We're going to control the behavior. We're going to render the app. And then we expect Alice, developer, to be inside of the component. There we're going to click on edit. We're going to set new values. For example, Alice updated for name. For role, we're going to say lead developer. And for department, we're going to leave it as is. And then click update employee. And then we expect the update employee to have been called once with these values inside of an object. And we expect to see Alice updated lead developer to be inside the document. The last one, deleting an employee. So again, we are going to call get employees. We're going to control the behavior. It's going to return Alice, developer, IT. We're going to mark delete employee. And then we are going to wait for Alice, developer, to be inside of the document. We're going to click on delete. And then we expect delete employee to have been called once. And we expect Alice to not be inside of the document. So these are the 4 tests that we have written for the app.tsx component. I have, provided some explanations, some comprehensive explanations inside of the note file. So first off, we are marking the functions of the employee API, as you can see here, right? So we are fully marking the employee API module. We're replacing the implementations with mocks. And then these mocks are controllable per test case, as I told you. We are going to control the behavior of these mock functions. The first one is load employee. Loads and displays employee. We are going to mark the implementation or control the implementation of this API.getEmployees. We're going to say that when this is called, what we expect is to get this single object. And then we render the component. We expect to see the loading in the component, because if you remember, we had a 500 milliseconds delay for the getEmployees function. And then we are going to wait for Alice developer to be visible inside of the document, because we are controlling the behavior of getEmployees. So getEmployees have been isolated, or let's say all of the functions coming from the employee API are isolated. They're dependencies, but we're controlling their behavior. So it marks the getEmployees to return a list with one employee, renders the app, verifies the loading state, right? And waits for the employee to appear in the UI. Now adding an employee. So adding an employee, if you take a look here, we are again, getting the employee. We are adding a new employee. The get employees is returning an empty array. Then we are controlling the behavior of add employee, right? So we are, controlling the behavior of this employee, add employee, and then we're going to return the app component. First, we expect to see loading in the document, and then we are going to set some values to the input fields. For name, role, and designer, we are going to create a new employee, Bob Designer Design, and then we are going to click on that add employee, and then we're going to wait. As you can see here, we're going to wait for the add employee, and we expect that to have been called with this single employee object, and then we expect this string to be rendered by the document. So this is the explanation. Updating a new employee. Again, we mark getEmployees to return, in this case, not an empty array, but an array with one single object. We want to update this, right? We are going to update, we're going to control the behavior of update employee function. And then we are going to render the app. We expect to see Alice developer coming from the single employee to be inside of the document. Then we are going to click on edit. We are going to set name and role to new values, right? Alice updated lead developer, because previously Alice was what? Was a developer. Now she's a lead developer. Then we're going to click on update employee, and we expect update employee to have been called once with these values, right? And then we expect this text to be inside of the component. And then the deleting. Again, we are controlling the behavior of getEmployees. It is returning one single object, and then we are going to, it is returning a string, an array with one single object. Then delete employee, which is going to return undefined. The delete employee function coming from the API doesn't return anything. Then we're going to render the app component. We expect this to be inside of the component. We click on delete, and we expect delete employee to have been called once. And then we expect that Alice to not be inside of the document. So this is the explanation of these 4 tests that we wrote for the functions coming from the add employee API file. Now, the last thing is to run these tests. So I'm going to say npx vtest run. We have 4 test files, 13 tests, and all of them have passed. So to summarize what we did in this video, we created a file called employee API, which is interfacing with a backend API. In this case, we do not have a backend API. We are maintaining a list of employees here. Then we updated the app.tsx to make use of this employee API file, right? And we are controlling the loading and the error state. And then for the tests, we wrote 4 tests for the 4 functions coming from employee API, but we mock them. We are controlling the behavior of these functions. And for testing the employee API functions itself, we could write a file. We could create a file here, very similar to what we did for this employee utils, and we could write tests specifically for the functions defined inside of employee API. But when it comes to testing the app.tsx, we do not want the actual implementations, the real implementations of employee API. We want to control that dependency. We want to mark that dependency because we want to focus solely on the behavior of the component. This is, a concept that we discussed in previous episodes as well. I'm going to wrap up this video here. Thank you so much again for sticking till the very end. And yeah, if you enjoyed watching this, give it a thumbs up, and I'll see you in the next one.